Walking through the forest on a hike used to be one of my favorite experiences in the world, until one day I ended up getting lost. It happened while I was on a walk along a trail that I had hiked dozens of times, only this time I decided to go down one of the pathways that I had never taken before. However, after walking for a couple of hours, I slowly realized that what I was walking on wasn't a hiking trail, but instead an old game trail. And just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the clouds began to roll in. I tried to follow the trail back, but the sunlight quickly faded from the sky as it quickly began to downpour. The rain was coming down in torrents as I made my way through the dense woods. As time dragged on, the day turned to night, and I was nowhere near finding my way back yet. The dark, stormy night made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead of me, and I spent hours trying to find my way back to the trailhead, but it seemed like every turn I took was the wrong one and just led me deeper into the heart of the forest. As the rain soaked through my clothes, a sense of unease began to settle over me. There was no denying it anymore. I was lost. Panic started to rise within me, but I knew that I had to stay calm. I couldn't afford to make any rash decisions. I needed to think clearly if I wanted to make it out of the woods alive. I tried to reorient myself, but there was no way that I could find any sense of direction through the storm that night. I cursed under my breath, feeling a sinking feeling in my stomach. I had relied too heavily on technology and hadn't brought a compass or a backup map. I decided to keep walking, hoping that I would stumble upon a familiar landmark or a sign that would point me in the right direction. The more I walked, the more disoriented I became. The rain seemed to distort my perception of distance and time, and every step I took felt like a step deeper into the unknown. As the night wore on, I realized that I had no choice but to seek shelter until the rain subsided. I spotted a large tree with a hollowed-out trunk and decided to take refuge there. It was far from ideal, but it offered some protection from the rain. Inside the hollowed trunk, I huddled against the damp wood, shivering from both the cold and fear. The sound of raindrops hitting the leaves above me was deafening, drowning out any other noise. As I tried to rest a bit and wait for daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there was something lurking in the darkness just beyond my sight. I tried to close my eyes and rest, but sleep eluded me. Every rustle of the leaves or snap of a branch sent my heart racing. The woods seemed alive with unseen creatures, their presence both haunting and menacing. And eventually, I couldn't take the anxiety anymore, and something in my body told me that I needed to keep moving. So I slowly got up and once again began hopelessly wandering the dark and dreary forest. As the night dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I thought I caught glimpses of shadowy figures darting between the trees. I couldn't be sure if it was my imagination playing tricks on me or if there was something truly out there. Doubt and fear began to consume me. I questioned my every decision, berating myself for getting lost in the first place. The woods had transformed from a place of beauty and tranquility into a nightmare, a prison from which I just couldn't escape. Hours passed in agonizing silence. The rain finally began to taper off, and a glimmer of hope sparked within me. I walked for what felt like an eternity, my legs heavy and my mind weary. Just as I was about to lose all hope, a flicker of light caught my eye. It was a distant glow, barely visible through the trees. With renewed determination, I stumbled toward it, pushing through thick foliage and slippery mud. As I emerged from the woods, I found myself standing at the edge of a road. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. A passing car stopped, and I climbed in, grateful for the warmth and safety it provided. Looking back at the woods disappearing into the distance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of profound gratitude. I had survived the night. The ordeal had pushed me to my limits, and yet I survived. I'll never forget my first night alone in my new house. It was a small one-bedroom home that was about 20 minutes away from my job on the outskirts of the city. After spending the day packing, I couldn't wait to go to sleep, but the storm that night seemed to keep me awake. The pitter-patter of rain against the window pane filled the room as I lay in bed, struggling to find sleep on that stormy night. The dim glow of the streetlights outside was casting eerie shadows that almost danced across the walls. The atmosphere was heavy and unsettling, but I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild. As I drifted in and out of consciousness, a sudden chill swept over me, causing me to jolt awake. I could feel it. It was like there was a presence in the room. My heart raced, and I slowly turned my head from one side of the room to the other. That was when I saw it. As soon as I glanced at the window, there it was, illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlight. I saw a pair of eyes staring directly at me. Fear coursed through my veins as I realized I was being watched. Panic set in, and I pulled the covers up to my chin, shielding myself from the intruder's gaze. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice seemed to be trapped within me, stifled by a combination of terror and disbelief. What was really terrifying was the fact that I noticed the person looking through my window. It was as if they were unfazed. The eyes outside the window remained fixed on me, unblinking and filled with an unsettling intensity. Who was this person? What did they want from me? My mind raced with countless questions, each one more terrifying than the last. Summoning all my courage, I slowly rose from the bed, careful not to make any sudden movements. The rain continued to drum against the glass, creating a disorienting soundtrack to this nightmare. I approached the window with trepidation, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drew nearer, the figure's features became clearer. It was a man. His face was being obscured by the shadows. I could feel his piercing gaze as if he could see into the depths of my soul, and the realization sent shivers down my spine. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911, desperate for help. But as I held the phone to my ear, all I heard was a dead silence, a complete absence of sound. It was as if the outside world had ceased to exist, leaving only me and the intruder locked in this macabre dance of terror. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I stood there, paralyzed by fear. The seconds that passed felt as if they dragged for hours, and the entire time the figure outside remained a motionless silhouette against the backdrop of rain-soaked streets. After a moment of locking eyes with the stranger, I managed to muster up the courage to reach for the curtains and draw them closed, hoping that he would just disappear. But as I reached forward, I paused as I noticed his eyes following my arm. I drew a deep breath into my lungs as I quickly finished closing the curtains, and then I took a step back from the window. It was as if a wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The realization that the intruder was still there, only now I couldn't see them, almost made the situation worse. And as I stood there wondering if I should open the blinds or not, I decided against my better judgment that I should at least check to see what they were doing. I slowly leaned forward and peered out through the crack in the center of the curtains, and I was surprised to see that the strange man was no longer there. I stepped back again and began thinking to myself, where had he gone? Would he return? That was when I heard it. A chill coursed through my body, and I turned to face my bedroom door as I heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying to turn the doorknob at the front door. I slowly moved out of my bedroom and into the hallway where I could clearly see the entrance to the house, and as I got closer to the door, I was certain that the noise I was hearing was the handle. I quickly closed the distance between myself and the door and turned the deadbolt lock to make sure that the door was secure, and when I did, the person on the other side must have heard it. They were no longer trying to turn the door handle anymore. Instead, the sound of banging coming from the other side made it seem like they were trying to kick the door in. I yelled out for them to stop, and when they didn't, I decided to lie and said that I called the police. At that moment, The banging on my front door stopped, and the only sound I could hear outside was the sound of raindrops. I waited by the front door for a few minutes and listened before walking around and ensuring that all the entrances into my home were sealed up. I spent the remainder of the night in a state of heightened vigilance, my senses on high alert. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind sent my heart racing. Sleep was an impossible feat, as the image of those haunting eyes continued to haunt my thoughts. Morning finally broke, bringing with it a sliver of reassurance. The sun's rays chased away the darkness, filling the room with warmth and light. But despite the daylight, a lingering sense of unease remained. I immediately contacted the authorities, recounting the terrifying events of the previous night. They arrived promptly, offering their reassurances and promising to investigate, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that the intruder's presence lingered even in his absence. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the incident remained etched in my memory. I became hyper-vigilant, installing security measures and double-checking every lock and window in my home. Sleep eluded me, plagued by nightmares of those piercing eyes. To this day, I am haunted by the knowledge that any time I look out my window, someone might be there watching me. The rain cascaded down in relentless sheets on that stormy night, obscuring my view of the road ahead as I embarked on a late-night drive through the desolate countryside. The rhythmic swish of the wipers was the only sound accompanying the drumming of raindrops against the windshield. The world outside seemed cloaked in darkness, both figuratively and literally, as if holding a secret I was about to uncover. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white with each passing mile. The desolate stretch of road seemed to stretch on indefinitely, lined with towering trees that swayed ominously in the wind. I couldn't help but feel a creeping unease settle over me, as if I was trespassing in a place where I didn't belong. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated a figure standing on the side of the road. I squinted my eyes and saw that it was a hitchhiker. They were soaked from head to toe and holding out a desperate thumb. Against my better judgment, I felt a twinge of compassion and pulled over, rolling down the window. "Need a lift?" I called out over the sound of the rain. The hitchhiker nodded with a look of gratitude etched upon their face as they climbed into the passenger seat. Their presence brought a sense of relief, as if the darkness had temporarily lifted. The air in the car grew heavy with silence, broken only by the drumming of rain against the roof. As we drove, a sense of foreboding settled over me. I stole glances at the hitchhiker, attempting to discern their features through the rain-streaked window, but their face remained hidden, concealed by the shadows. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the tension. They turned their heads slowly toward me, their eyes glinting in the dim light. "Anywhere," they replied with an unnerving smile. "I don't really have a plan yet." I thought that was a strange response. Unease gnawed at the pit of my stomach, but I pushed my fears aside. I told myself I was just being paranoid and that they were just a person seeking shelter from the storm. But as we continued down the rain-soaked road, the hitchhiker's demeanor began to change. Their smile twisted into a sinister grin, and their eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity. Panic tightened its grip on me, and I considered pulling over and demanding they leave the vehicle, but fear held me back, chaining me to this macabre journey. Minutes turned into hours, and the world outside became a blur of darkness and rain. The hitchhiker's presence grew increasingly unsettling, their body language sending waves of unease coursing through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped, an unwitting passenger in a sinister game that was taking place in my own car. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, I made a split-second decision. I abruptly pulled over, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm really sorry about this, but I'm going to have to ask you to get out of the car, please," I said, my voice quivering with both fear and resolve. I pointed at a building that wasn't too far away and said that he could find shelter there as I hoped he would just get out. That was when the hitchhiker turned to me, their eyes gleaming with an unholy light. "You know, I was about to ask you the same thing," they hissed, their voice dripping with malevolence. Without waiting for a response, I realized that I had brought danger into my car and was now concerned about what would happen if I didn't listen to them. I threw open the car door and stumbled out into the rain-soaked night. I could feel their gaze burning into my back as I ran, my footsteps splashing through puddles, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't dare look back, fearing what I might see. Minutes turned into an eternity as I sprinted through the darkness, desperate to put distance between myself and the haunting presence that had infiltrated my car. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs threatened to give way beneath me, but I pressed on, fueled by adrenaline and sheer terror. Finally, another passing car saw me running through the rain and pulled over to see if I needed help. I explained to them what had happened to me, and they were kind enough to let me use a cell phone that they had. I made 2 calls, one to the police who came and took my statement, and one to my dad to let him know that my car had been stolen and I needed someone to pick me up. The police told me that they would keep an eye out for my car, but they never followed up on that, which tells me that the hitchhiker I had helped out stole my car that night. And although that sucked, I'm thankful that I was able to escape the incident unscathed and unharmed. At first, I never really minded working the overnight shift at the 7-Eleven near my house, but that changed when they switched it from 2 staff members overnight to 1. Once I was by myself, as a girl I immediately felt less safe in that store overnight, especially since I was only a teenager fresh out of high school at the time. I tried my best to make it work, but the pressure was starting to get to me. And then on the night before I told my manager that I needed to switch shifts, my worst fears came true. It was a little bit after midnight, and it was a surprisingly busy night, believe it or not. Usually by that point, the only people that stop by are just getting gas, but for some reason, we had a few people in the store grabbing some things that they needed. As I sat there checking out a person's order and getting ready to hand them their change, I couldn't help but notice that there was one man who was standing toward the back of the store. He seemed like he was making it look like he was shopping, but then never picked anything up. And every now and then, I swear that I would feel him looking up toward the register. I kept looking over at him to make sure that he wasn't trying to steal anything, but every time I did, he just looked away. Then one by one, everybody in the store began to bring their items up to the register and then left the store. Everyone except for him. Once that last other person walked out the door and got into their car, I looked over to the man and saw that he wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He was looking right up at me from the other side of the store. I tried to stay calm, but something in my gut told me that I needed to get out of that store as fast as I could. I slowly started to walk away from the register and towards the phone that was on the wall behind me, but as soon as I took a step, the man began running towards the counter. I screamed as he climbed over the small barrier that usually separated me from the customers, and before I knew it, I was staring down the barrel of a small handgun. He began yelling for me to put the phone down as he continued to push the gun in my face, and once I did, he grabbed me by the collar and threw me toward the register. He demanded that I take the money out and give it to him, as well as wanting me to scan a handful of scratch-off tickets for him. I could hear him rummaging through the cigarettes on the wall behind me as I scanned the tickets, but I was too afraid to try to escape for fear of being shot. After I was all done, I hoped that he would just leave, but instead, he tried to pull me away from the counter. I tried to fight him off, but quickly realized it was pointless when I felt the hard metal of the gun hit me in the back side of my head. I could feel myself getting more and more lightheaded as the man dragged me across the store and toward the walk-in freezer. After dragging me inside, he dropped me onto the floor and then left me there to freeze. He closed the door behind me, and I'll never forget the sound of the lock latching from the other side. I tried to sit up, but the head wound was making my head throb. That was when I realized that he didn't take my phone out of my pocket before leaving me. I managed to slowly move around and muster the strength to pull the phone out of my pocket, but as I dialed 911, I started to get dizzy. And just as I heard the operator's voice answer, my head fell to the floor and I passed out. The next thing I remember is waking up in the back of an ambulance before being brought to the hospital to get a few stitches in the side of my head. Thankfully, the police were able to use the GPS from my phone to find my location and get help to me. The very next day, I called my boss and told them that I needed to switch off the night shift, and she totally understood. For a while, I was working midday shifts as a security guard over at a small hotel that was only 5 minutes away from my house, and I couldn't have asked for a better job. That all changed though when I got transferred for a week to work security over at an abandoned building that had just been purchased for remodeling. It wasn't so much the abandoned building part that bothered me at first, it was the overnights. I never really had good experiences working overnight as a security guard, and this certainly wouldn't change that. On my first night at the building, nothing seemed too bad. I had to do a few walkthroughs of the place, but for the most part, I was able to just sit at my desk in the front of the building and make sure that no one tried to vandalize the place or have any parties. I'll never forget how surprisingly quiet it was in the building on that first night. There was no electricity or plumbing active in the building at the time, so it was practically silent. That all changed on the second night. It was about 10:15 and I was just starting to do my second pass-through of the building when I had to stop myself. I began shining my flashlight around as I listened closely. I wasn't quite sure what it was at first, but I could definitely hear a sound coming from deeper into the building. I slowly made my way down the hallway with my flashlight pointing forward, and as I got closer to the source of the noise, it continued to get loud. I stopped myself before rounding a corner as I took in a deep breath. Not knowing what to expect since I still couldn't really recognize the sound, I was hesitant to go any further. I listened closely, hoping to identify the noise, but all I could make out was this strange scratching sort of sound. That's when my head jumped to the conclusion that there was an animal somewhere in the building. Sadly, that wasn't the case, and I ended up being wrong. Before I realized that though, I walked around the corner with confidence, expecting to see some sign of raccoons or something in the hallway. But to my surprise, there was nothing there. I looked around and listened to reassure myself that the scratching sound was coming from that direction, and then I continued to walk toward it. I was standing in the middle of the hall when the sound was loudest, and I quickly realized that it was coming from the other side of the wall. At that point, I still expected it to be some sort of animal to be in the wall because of the scratching noise, but now I was thinking I might have to check each of the rooms to see where it got in from. But again, I was wrong. I slowly approached the entrance to the room that I was closest to and got ready to place my hand on the door and open it. I took in a deep breath, hoping that there wasn't anything dangerous on the other side, and then slowly opened the door and stepped into the room. I almost jumped out of my skin when I looked toward the wall that I heard the scratching sound coming from, because to my surprise, instead of an animal, I saw a person crouched over in the corner, clawing violently at the wall. I tried to step back out of the room without them noticing me, but as the floorboard creaked when I took the weight of my left foot off of it, they snapped their head in my direction. Even though I was clearly looking at a grown man, it was almost as if I was staring down a horrifying predator as he bared his teeth at me and began to scream as violently as he was clawing at the wall. I started to step back out of the room as fast as I could when the man stood from his crouched position and began running toward me. I slammed the door shut behind me and began running through the building back toward the front entrance. With every step that I took as I ran, I could hear the man behind me making these strange shrieking-like noises as he chased me through the halls. Thankfully, I managed to keep my distance from him as I reached my station and grabbed the radio that I used to communicate with my manager on duty. After grabbing the radio, I continued running until I was out of the building, and then I let my boss know that he needed to get the police down to the building as fast as they could. I kept my distance from the building, but continued to watch the front door to see if the man who chased me had left, but I didn't see anything. That being said, by the time the police got there, he must have escaped the same way that he snuck in, because there was no sign of the man. We went back to the room that I found him in and checked out the wall that he was clawing through, and we couldn't find anything. But according to the officers, the man was likely looking for copper wiring to scrap or sell for whatever habits he had. No matter what his reasoning was for being there, I let my boss know that I either needed another guard with me overnight or I needed to be transferred to a different building. They were very understanding and actually ended up sending me back to the small hotel that I was working at before the overnight shifts. My first maintenance job was for a building in Chicago back in 1996, and to this day I can say that I've never worked another job like it. The position was for an overnight maintenance worker / building superintendent, and as soon as they offered me the job, I took it. It came with an office in the basement that I shared with the daytime workers, and I got 3 days off every week, so all in all, it didn't seem too bad on paper. But I learned pretty quickly that I would need to entertain myself because there weren't a lot of problems that needed my attendance overnight. According to the other workers though, that wouldn't be the case during the winter with all of the pipes freezing, so I tried not to get used to it. It was probably the middle of my second week on the job when I got my first official call, and it was up to a new resident that had moved in on the 4th floor. He called in saying that water wasn't coming out of the shower head, so I grabbed my tools and made my way upstairs as fast as I could, eager to show that I was capable of doing good work. And when I got there, I was relieved to find that it was a really easy job. In fact, he probably didn't even need to call me, because the only problem was that the water hookup to the shower was turned to the off position so the water wouldn't pass through the pipe. All I had to do was turn the valve and they were good to go. However, as I went to say bye and to wish them good night, the man stopped me to thank me for my work. I told him that it was no problem at all, and he asked me if I worked the following night. I responded by saying that I do, and if he needed anything to just call down and I'll be up to help. I went back down to the maintenance office after that and had a relatively boring rest of the night. The next day on my shift, I was surprised when I heard a knock on the door. I answered it and saw the tenant that I had helped out the other day with a bag of McDonald's. At first, I tried to tell him that I wasn't able to have visitors in the office, but he was persistent. He said he just wanted to thank me for helping out, so eventually I invited him in to enjoy a burger and fries. I thought he was a little strange with the way he talked, but that changed as we got to know each other a bit better. I learned that he had just moved to Chicago from New York, and we eventually agreed to hang out sometime so I could introduce him to some people. Not long after that, he went back up to his apartment, and that was the last time I saw anyone that night since no one needed any help in their apartments. The following day, around the same time, I heard a knock on the door again, and when I answered it, I wasn't surprised this time to see that same tenant. This time though, things seemed a bit different about him. I told him that I was expecting a pretty busy night and didn't really have time for a meal again, but this time he said that he brought drinks. I chuckled a bit thinking that he was joking because I obviously couldn't drink on the job, but he didn't like that. As soon as I started laughing at what I thought was a joke, the man locked eyes with me and asked in a very quiet voice if I was laughing at him. I told him that I wasn't and that I thought he was making a joke, but by that point, he was already trying to force his way into the office. I tried to hold the door shut, but despite him being a bit smaller than I was, he was able to push right through it. I stepped back as the tenant entered the office, yelling about how I shouldn't go around laughing at people. I tried to explain to him that I didn't mean to offend him, but once he was in better lighting and I saw how big his pupils were, I realized that I wasn't dealing with someone who was sober. I asked the man to please calm down one more time, but before I could finish the word down, He threw the bag of bottles that he was holding in my direction. I tried to catch them, but they slipped right through my hands and smacked me in the bottom of my chin and my throat. I stumbled backward as the man lunged at me. I tried to fight him off as I caught my breath, but it was no use. He easily managed to force me to the ground and then with both hands around my neck, began choking me. The sound of his jumbled screaming began to fade out as everything around me started to turn black. And just like that, I was out. I'm pretty sure that the tenant had thought he killed me, but I ended up waking up sometime later to find that my wallet was missing, as well as the TV in the office and the landline. I went to the first floor and used another tenant's phone to call the police, and they went up to talk to the man who attacked me, but he was nowhere to be found. After searching his apartment, the officers couldn't figure out where he had gone, but they found what they believed to be a trap for me waiting in his room. According to them, they found handcuffs along with various knives and a large roll of plastic stashed underneath the tenant's bed. The man never returned to the apartment, and we ended up getting rid of all his things by the end of that month before cleaning and putting it back up for rent. I only worked at that job for another couple of months before a better position opened up at another building owned by the same company, and I never looked back. As a trucker, there are pretty much only a few options for where you can sleep at night while on the road. If you're really tired or nowadays over your daily driving limit, you can just pull over on the side of the road if there's room. If you're lucky, you'll find a truck stop with enough open spaces for you to park and catch a few hours of sleep. Then there's my least favorite, parking in the back of a public lot and sleeping. The most common places you'll find truckers doing this are at big stores like Walmart, but just because it's common doesn't always mean it's safe. That being said, one of my worst nights on the road was when I happened to be picking up a large shipment from a department store in the same plaza as a Walmart. It was an out-of-state delivery that brought me near Eagle Pass, Texas, right on the border between Texas and Mexico. And because the pickup was so early in the morning, I decided to sleep in the back of the parking lot. The only upside to this was that I got to go inside and grab some food to eat. That being said, as soon as I walked out of the store, I started to regret my decision. I was walking toward my truck, and to my surprise, I noticed two guys walking out from behind the passenger side as if they were trying to do something to my truck. I asked them if I could help them with anything and why they were standing so close to the truck when they have a whole parking lot to be in. They didn't give me a straight answer. They basically just snickered and walked past me as if I wasn't even there. I decided to just brush it off and not get into any sort of conflict, so I just got back in my truck and began eating my food as I watched a show on my phone. About an hour passed, and by that point, the sun had finally set, and I was getting pretty tired from being on the road all day, so I got ready to lay down. I made sure both the doors were locked, and then I pulled the curtain sealing off the cab and the driving compartment before laying down and going to sleep. After sleeping for a few hours, I woke up to a loud noise that sounded like it was coming from the back of my truck. I sat up and got ready to check it out when, out of nowhere, I heard the sound of glass shattering. I leapt up to my feet as the passenger side door of the truck unlocked, and one of the guys I saw earlier that night rushed into the truck. I put my hands up to cover my face as I saw something swinging toward me. The impact of what I noticed later was a metal bar, most likely the crowbar from the back of my truck, sent a shock through my entire upper body as it cracked into my arms. I fell backward, but was quickly grabbed and pulled out of the truck before being thrown onto the cold parking lot. I looked up, but my eyes took a second to adjust to the street lights, and by the time I was able to see the two people standing over top me, I felt the metal bar slam down on me. I keeled over and began laying in the fetal position as the two guys continued to hit me, and when they were finally finished, I could feel them rummaging through my pocket. I rolled to my side to try to keep them from getting my keys, but as soon as they saw I was conscious, they began striking me again, this time until I blacked out. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I finally woke up, I could tell that I wasn't on the gravel anymore. I couldn't see anything around me. But as I felt around with my hands, I realized that I was in the back of my truck with the shipment. I took a second to take everything in, and I realized how hard it was for me to breathe. With each breath I took, it felt like I was being stabbed in the lungs. Before I could bring myself to sit all the way up, I felt a bit of shaking, which told me that the two guys had stolen my truck with me in the back of it. I tried my best not to move at first because of the pain that I was feeling from almost every side of my body. But as I felt the truck slowly come to a stop, I knew that I needed to get ready for anything. I didn't know where we were or what these guys wanted. I slowly sat myself up and then managed to bring myself onto my knees. I slowly crawled toward the back of the truck toward the door. I didn't really have a plan. I just knew that once they opened the door, I needed to get as far away from them as possible by any means necessary. The moments passed and there was no movement from the front of the truck or the truck itself since we stayed parked. But after what felt like an hour, I finally heard the sound of both the driver and the passenger side door opening and closing. I prepared myself as I heard the latch at the bottom of the door unlocking. As it slid open though, I was unable to move as I was blinded by two flashlights pointed right at me. That was when I heard something I didn't expect. It turned out the two guys who mugged me and stole my truck were driving so poorly that they got themselves pulled over. I was now staring at two uniformed officers who promised me that an ambulance was on the way and that I was going to be just fine. When all was said and done, I was told that the two men had connections to a group in Mexico, and they believed that the men were attempting to cross the border with the shipment to sell the truck and the products we were shipping. There's no telling what would have happened to me if the truck had successfully made it across the border, but something tells me that I wouldn't be alive right now. I used to think that driving a truck in New York City was the toughest job that I ever had. But the second I started driving for a distribution center further upstate, I realized that those dense city streets were nothing compared to the winding mountain roads, especially when it rains. Now, my biggest mistake came when I was dragging old habits from driving in the city to the new area that I was working in. It was my third week on the job, and I was heading from the warehouse in Wurtsboro, New York, with a shipment that was going up toward Albany. It was about 1:30 in the morning when I noticed that the rain was starting to come down and I turned my wipers on. I let out a groan because I knew that this meant I would have to slow down whenever the GPS took me off the highway, which happened pretty frequently, especially toward the end of the drive as I was passing over the mountain. As soon as I got onto the off-ramp, I began slowing the truck down and continued to take it as slow as I could as I began winding my way down the mountainside. My speed started to pick up a bit, but I didn't want to lock the brakes unnecessarily, so I only slightly pressed on the brakes, which probably wasn't the smartest decision I've made. The speed continued to pick up, and finally, I decided that I needed to press the brakes a bit harder. But as soon as I did, I felt the truck starting to slip out as if I had just begun to hydroplane. I finally felt my tires gain traction again and I slammed down on the brakes, but it was too late. A turn was coming up and I tried my best to make it, but as the truck was coming to a stop, the front end of the cab tore right through the guardrail. I closed my eyes as I expected the truck to go flying off the side of the mountain, but somehow it managed to come to a stop before the entire thing went over. I opened my eyes as the truck came to a complete stop, and I looked in the side mirrors and saw that the rear section of the truck was caught on the guardrail. That was the only reason why I wasn't sent plummeting downward, likely to my death. I slowly moved to lean out of the window to see if there was anything underneath me, and as I leaned my head out, I could see that there was about 20 feet of nothing between me and the ground below. I slowly sat back down in my seat as I tried to figure out my best course of action. I reached for my phone, and as I moved a bit, I could hear the sound of creaking in the metal behind me. I moved even slower as I grabbed my phone and called emergency services for help. I told them my location and the situation I was in, and they assured me that help was on the way and not to move. I have to admit, I contemplated trying to climb out of the door and over to the road, but as I said, every move I made seemed to disturb the position of the truck, so I didn't want to risk causing it to fall further. I sat there for 3 hours as I waited for the fire department to reach me. With each gust of wind that blew by, I prayed that the truck would hold me up. Finally, the fire department figured that their best course of action would be to lean a ladder out toward my truck with a harnessed up fireman on it. Once he got to my door, he asked me to slowly open it, but to not let it swing open. I moved as cautiously as possible as I reached for the handle and opened the door. I tried to open it slowly like he said, but as soon as it was cracked, the wind whipped up and tossed it open. The truck shook a bit and all of us held our breath wondering what was going to happen. Thankfully, it didn't budge as much as I feared, and once the door was open, the firemen helped me into a harness and then out onto the ladder that they extended over toward me. I crawled back to the safety of the road and looked back to my truck as I wondered what was going to happen. The emergency services informed me that a towing company would be called to move the truck and get it off the mountain, but in the meantime, I was given a ride to the nearest hospital to make sure that I didn't have any injuries. I was fine though. The truck was in far worse shape than I was, considering that it took them a whole day to pull it back onto the road. The frame was damaged beyond repair. The only bright side of the entire event was that I came out of it unscathed. Whenever I needed to pull a really early shipment from a warehouse, I prefer to just sleep in my truck in the parking lot rather than going home and driving to the warehouse to pick up the rig in the morning. The peace you find can often turn into something haunting. I learned that it was probably best for my own peace of mind to stop looking out the truck windows at night after what I saw underneath the streetlights. I still can't quite explain it, but I'm almost positive that it was another person. But their actions were so strange. You see, it was the middle of June on a night after it had just rained, so the air was filled with a thick fog that made it nearly impossible to see anything. Even the lights in the parking lot only seemed to be able to brighten up the spot directly underneath them. As I sat in my truck, getting settled in for the night, I pulled out my hot plate and got ready to make a small box of mac and cheese for myself. Normally, that was my favorite part of the night, but for some reason, I couldn't shake this feeling that there was someone watching me. I kept looking out the windows and around the truck, but from what I could tell at first, there was nothing or no one there. I decided to cook and then eat my food as the time continued to flow. And just as I was getting ready to step outside and rinse the pot that I cooked in out with a jug of water that I kept in the back, I saw it. Looking through the passenger side window, I could see what seemed to be a figure dressed all in white, standing underneath the streetlight. It was hard to distinguish what it was that I was looking at from the fog that surrounded it, but as I continued to look, I could make out more and more details. After sitting in the passenger seat just watching them, it appeared as if they were staring directly back at me. Now, even though everything in my body was telling me to just stay in the truck, I also started to wonder if maybe it was just a warehouse worker who might need help with their car or something. Against my better judgment, I began rolling my window down a bit and called out from my truck, asking them if they needed any help, but there was no response. The figure just cocked its head to the side a bit and continued to stare in my direction. After a moment of silence passed, I was too uncomfortable to leave the window open anymore, so I closed it and then made sure that all the doors were locked and secured. I turned to look over to the driver's side to make sure that the door was locked all the way, and by the time I looked back to the streetlight, the figure was gone. For a second, I felt a bit of relief, but then that overwhelming feeling of something watching me was back. I frantically looked around the fog, hoping to catch a glimpse of where that person went. It took me a moment, but eventually, I found them. I practically jumped out of my seat and into the back of my cab out of fear as I noticed that they were now walking toward my truck with their heads still cocked to the side. Even though I was sure that I was looking at a person, I couldn't help but get the sense that there was something much darker involved here, even though I know that's ridiculous. I locked eyes with the figure as it got closer and closer to my door. To my surprise, it eventually passed right by me, but to my horror, I realized that it was only to circle around the truck. The figure disappeared behind the truck's blind spot, and that was when I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. As if they were dragging metal across metal, there was this intense screeching noise that came from the trailer that was hooked up to the back of the truck. I tried to find the source of the noise, but by the time it stopped, I couldn't see anything or anyone. I sat in my truck for another few minutes in fear, looking over my shoulder every other second, wondering where that person had gone to. Thankfully, they never came back. But when I woke up the next morning and stepped outside the cab to do my inspection, I realized that there was a massive scratch running along the back end of the trailer. I looked around for any sign of the person that I had seen the previous night, but I couldn't find anything. And when I spoke to the warehouse manager about the incident, she mentioned that a similar instance occurred to another driver about 2 years before me, but no one could ever find out who it was that was standing in the parking lot. All I know is that was the last time I decided to sleep in the cab instead of in my bed when I had the option, even if it means waking up and driving to the truck really early in the day. Road trips used to be one of my favorite ways to spend my weekends off. I used to just drive until I found some place that seemed interesting, and then I would stop in to check it out. Sometimes I would get a motel room while I was on the road, and others I would just sleep in my car. But as long as I was out doing things on my time off, I was happy. That all changed though when I decided to take a trip down south to visit a museum that focused on the history of music. The trip to the museum was great. I loved all the sights from the highway that I got to take in, and the hotel that I stayed at in town that night was actually really nice for the price I paid for it. It was the trip back that became a nightmare. You see, it was about a 9-hour drive from the hotel back to my house, and my plan was to simply drive throughout the entire night so that I could make it home early in the morning to get ready for work the next day. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to make the entire 9 hours, but I have to admit, it started off pretty well. I managed to drive until about 2 in the morning before I had to make my first stop. I had to use the restroom, so I made sure to keep my eye open for any signs of a rest area, and luckily for me, there was one coming up right after the next exit. I drove down the highway until I finally saw the off-ramp that led to the rest area, which was surprisingly empty. There was only one other car in the parking lot, and as I parked, I noticed that it seemed like no one was inside of it. I quickly checked my phone after parking and messaged my mom to let her know that I was still driving but should be home by the morning, and then I locked the doors and headed toward the men's room. I stepped inside and noticed that there was someone in there already. I assumed it was the owner of the other car in the parking lot. It's awkward to spark up any sort of conversation in the restroom, so I just planned on ignoring him and going about my business, when out of nowhere I heard a voice say, "Excuse me." I turned behind me and noticed that there was a second man in the bathroom who was now standing between me and the door to leave. I asked him if I could help him with anything, and that was when he told me that he needed a couple of things from me. I was curious to hear what he wanted, but that was when he started rattling off a list of my personal possessions, like my phone, my wallet, and my car keys. At first, I tried to laugh it off as if it was some sort of bad joke, but that was when I felt something sharp start pressing into my side. The man that I had first noticed in the bathroom was now standing right up against me with something pressed against my ribs. I tried to stay calm as I looked around, hoping that there was a way out of that situation, but I couldn't think of anything. And when I didn't respond right away by giving them my things, I'll never forget the pain that I felt as the man slowly started to press harder and harder. I could feel the pressure from the point of the blade getting ready to rip into me as I yelled out, "Okay, fine." And I began slowly rummaging through my pockets for my phone, wallet, and keys. As soon as I handed them over, I felt the pressure from the blade being lifted as the man behind me stepped backwards. "Don't follow us," the man said very calmly as the two of them walked out the bathroom. Within a few seconds, I heard the sound of my car starting up and ripping out the parking lot, along with the other car that they had brought there. I made my way out of the parking lot with nothing to do other than wait and hope that someone stopped by soon. However, help didn't come until around 7 in the morning when a silver van pulled into the rest stop. I gave them a chance to use the bathroom before I asked them for help, but once I explained what happened to them, they were more than happy to let me use their phone and call the police. I waited for the officers to arrive and then I reported the incident. The police told me that they would keep an eye out for my car, but there wasn't much else they could do about it. Thankfully, that ended up being enough though, because less than 2 weeks later, I got a call saying that they found my car and one of the men who stole it from me. And while the other robber is still out there, I know at least one is behind bars at least for the next couple of years. I was in the middle of a road trip with 2 of my friends, and although the trip started out filled with energy, it slowly died out as the night dragged on. However, none of us could see the oncoming nightmare that was about to unfold before us, though looking back on it, it was all highly avoidable. You see, as we continued to drive down the empty stretch of road, I began to slow the car down as I noticed a hitchhiker standing alone on the roadside. We could just barely make out his extended arm and thumb indicating that he was looking for some help, and as we got closer, everyone in the car got quiet. None of us knew whether we should stop and offer him a lift or if we should listen to that feeling in our gut that was telling us it wasn't safe to stop. In the end though, sympathy won, and we pulled over, allowing the hitchhiker to climb in. My friend in the passenger seat decided that he would give the man his seat and sit in the back with our other friend, and the hitchhiker seemed very grateful for it. Sadly, we couldn't seem to shake this feeling of discomfort that seemed to fill the air as soon as the man stepped in. As we began driving down the road, I couldn't help but glance over to the man that we had picked up, and I could see his eyes darting around erratically. The road stretched out before us as the night grew colder as we tried to make small talk, but the hitchhiker started asking some normal questions like where we were from or where we were headed, but eventually he seemed to not want to talk anymore. Silence once again overtook the car. A chill crawled up my spine as we continued to drive on, and as the miles passed, the atmosphere in the car grew increasingly tense. The hitchhiker's behavior became more and more erratic as he began turning the radio on and off and fidgeting with everything in the front seat. When I asked him to please stop messing with everything, his demeanor started to shift. A scowl grew over his face and his eyes locked onto me as if I had offended him. Out of nowhere, the hitchhiker's hand darted toward me, his fingers curling into a claw-like grip. Panic seized me as I fought against his grip. My friends were shouting and begging for him to stop. The car swerved erratically as chaos ensued. In a desperate attempt to escape, I stopped the car and quickly flung open the car door and threw myself out onto the road, my body scraping against the rough asphalt. My heart pounded as I stumbled back onto my feet. I could hear my friends calling out from within the car that had now stopped about 10 feet away from me. The hitchhiker sprang out from the passenger side of the car, and I could see that he had a menacing look on his face as he began to advance toward me. Each step he took filled me with terror, and as he got closer and closer, panic rushed through my body, and I did the only thing I could think of doing. I sprinted as fast as I could in the opposite direction. The wind hitting my face caused my eyes to water more than they already were, and my vision became distorted as I ran from my attacker. All I could do as I ran was hope that I could find help or safety somewhere close. And then, like a single beacon of hope, I saw a roadside diner in the distance. I ran through the parking lot as fast as I could, and I rushed through the doors gasping to catch my breath. My body was trembling, and all of the patrons took notice as they turned their heads to face me. I managed to explain my ordeal between ragged breaths, and they called the police. My friends ended up pulling into the diner shortly before the authorities arrived. They managed to get away from him as he was chasing after me. Once the police arrived, they searched for the hitchhiker. There was a mixture of relief and lingering dread that washed over me. While I was happy that they were doing everything that they could to help, I couldn't help but think that the man who tried to attack me was still out there waiting to make a victim out of someone else. As I drove along that road alone, the only thing that I had to keep my company was the faint glow of the dashboard lights. Sometimes that's all a girl needs though, a car and a road to drive on. Now, had I known that my simple road trip would turn into one of the worst experiences of my life, I probably wouldn't have opted to go by myself. But you never think anything bad is going to happen to you until it actually does. I learned that the hard way as I rounded a bend. Up until that point, I was the only car on the road that night. I hadn't seen headlights in what felt like hours, and then out of nowhere, a car appeared in my rearview mirror. Its headlights were blinding, so I decided to ease over to the side of the road to give them some space, assuming that the driver just wanted to pass me. That didn't seem to be the case though, as instead of passing me, they simply matched the pace of my car. I immediately started to feel uneasy about the situation and glanced over to the car beside me, though the driver was indistinguishable aside from their silhouette. My heart hammered against my chest as the car edged closer to me. At that moment, I knew that I needed to take action before something bad happened to me. I tried slowing down even more, but the car continued to match my pace, almost blocking me up against the side of the road. So that was when I tried to speed up, and to my surprise, the car beside me wasn't able to keep up with me at first. I managed to pull ahead of them a bit and then cut them off to keep them behind me as I accelerated, hoping to create a bit of distance between us. But as my speed increased, so did theirs. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing with scenarios of what could await me if I didn't find safety. I took an abrupt turn onto a smaller, winding road. My hands trembled on the wheel as I glanced back, hoping to lose my pursuer amidst the darkness. But to my horror, they were still there. The minutes seemed to drag on for hours as I navigated the streets in search of any sort of assistance. I thought about calling the police, but I couldn't find the chance to reach for my phone in my bag. I was trapped in a game of cat and mouse, and I didn't know what to do. That was when an idea popped into my head. I was coming up on a small town, and because I knew that there would be people there, I decided to veer off the highway and into the heart of the town. The streets were empty considering how late it was at night, but I continued to look around for any sort of life. Suddenly, I felt a bit of hope as I spotted a gas station up ahead. I pulled into the parking lot. I threw the car door open and sprinted inside looking for the first person that I could find. I explained what was going on and asked if I could wait there while I called the police, to which the clerk agreed as he locked the door to make sure that we were safe from my pursuer. It didn't take long for us to hear the sound of sirens coming toward the gas station, and as I looked out into the parking lot, I could see the car that had been following me slowly pull out and drive off in the opposite direction. A couple of police officers tried to pursue the driver, but they were unable to stop him. Thankfully though, I made it home safe that night, and though I've experienced road rage incidents since then, nothing has ever been quite as scary as that experience. My friend Kaylin and I worked together for years and had finally accrued enough days off between the two of us to take a small vacation together to a cabin near a lake that my uncle owned. It was a bit of a road trip getting there, but with about a 10-hour drive ahead of us, in June of 2014, we set off on our trip. We left my apartment at around 5 in the morning with hopes of getting to the cabin while it was still daylight out. However, about halfway through our drive, the car started acting up. At first, I thought that it might need some oil or something simple like that, so I had Kaylin look for the nearest place where we could get a quick oil change, and she found one that was close by. There was a small line of cars in front of us, so we ended up sitting for about an hour before finally getting serviced, and then we were back on the road. The car seemed to be holding up fine for a little while after the oil change, and we managed to make it about 40 minutes away from the cabin without another incident. This time though, the problem came when my phone, which we were using for GPS, lost the little bit of signal that it had. We checked Kaylin's phone to see if we could use her GPS app, but she wasn't getting any service either. Now, normally I would have been concerned, but I recognized where we were and I was confident that I could get us to that cabin without it. I continued driving down the road for another 20 minutes or so, and then I saw the small side road that eventually turned into a dirt trail that we would drive down to get to the cabin. As we got closer and closer, I remember getting excited, although I was a little bummed out that it was already starting to get dark, which meant that we would have to wait until the following day to do anything outside. Now, if that was the worst of our issues, it would have been a pretty good vacation. But I'll never forget the sound that the car began making almost as soon as the road transitioned from asphalt to dirt. There was this horrendous grinding sound that started coming from the engine, and then the car slowly came to a stop as smoke began to pour out of the exhaust pipe. I had managed to pull the car to the side of the trail in case any other vehicles needed to pass, but as far as I knew, there were no other cabins or houses out there, so I wasn't sure if we would end up seeing anyone or not. Kaylin and I sat there in silence for a minute before she asked me what we were going to do. I figured that it was getting dark, and since the odds of someone helping us that night seemed unlikely, our best bet would be to walk the last half of a mile to the cabin and hope that we can get that car fixed in the morning. We stepped out of the protection of the car and onto the dirt trail as we made our way toward the trunk to pull out our bags before starting our walk to the cabin. By that point, it was getting a bit hard to see because of how dark it was, but as long as we followed the trail, I knew we'd be fine. I didn't account for anything else that might be lurking in those woods that night. We made it about 20 feet away from the car, and Kaylin suddenly stopped. I looked at her, and before I could ask her what was wrong, I was pretty sure I knew what was freaking her out. In the distance, we could hear the faintest of noises that almost sounded like something moving around among the sticks and twigs. We both focused our attention in the direction that the noise was coming from, and out of the dark appeared a pair of glowing orange eyes. I put my arm out in front of Kaylin and very quietly told her to back up toward the car. We both slowly walked backward with our eyes locked onto the creature in the woods. We managed to take a few steps before we noticed that the eyes in the forest disappeared. We continued walking backward toward our car, and as we reached the front of it, I noticed them again. The orange reflective eyes were now locked back on me, only this time they seemed to be much closer. It was then that I could see that we were locked in a staring contest with a massive-looking wolf. And I don't know if you've ever seen a wolf in person, but they're quite a bit bigger than you'd expect. We could hear the quiet sound of it snarling as I reached for the door handle, and once we were both ready, we quickly slung the door open and hopped into the car as fast as we could. Just as I was closing the door behind me, I looked over and saw that the wolf was now standing no more than 2 feet away from my driver's side door. Kaylin and I caught our breath as we tried to figure out what to do. We couldn't call anyone for help because my phone was dead, and there was no way for us to get to the cabin that night. We decided to wait in the car until daylight broke, and then we hoped that the fear would disappear. I'm glad we waited too, because as the night pressed on, one by one more and more pairs of eyes began popping up in the darkness to watch us in our car. It wasn't until around 5 or 6 in the morning that we saw the wolves slowly start to lose interest in us. Even then, we still waited until just before noon to finally make a break for the cabin. We felt much braver in the daylight, but still with each step we took, we half expected to see one of those large beasts chasing us. Thankfully, we made it to the cabin, and the key that my uncle gave me worked just fine. As soon as we were inside, we made sure that the electricity was turned on and searched around for a landline that we could possibly use. Once we found the cabin's phone, we began making calls to see if we could get my car fixed. We didn't spend much time outside the cabin for obvious reasons, but thankfully we were able to get the car towed and fixed at a local shop. Then, after taking a cab to pick up the car, Kaylin and I made our trip back home without any ambition of returning to the woods anytime soon. It was the middle of spring in 2002 when my friend Devin and I were on a road trip back home from visiting family that he had over in Denver. The night air was filled with fog as I drove our car around a long and treacherous-seeming mountain road. The mist was making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of us, and despite the fact that we were driving as slow as we could, we both still gripped our seats as tight as we could during every turn that we made. The tension was heavy around us as the wind continued to howl outside as we drove farther and farther. As the fog slowly turned into heavy rain, the road became noticeably slicker than it was a few moments prior, and it wasn't long before the car began to skid across the soaking wet asphalt. I looked over to Devin to make sure that he was all right, but I saw that he was fixated on the road in front of us. I turned back to focus on the road, but in that second that I looked away, I managed to not make note of the turn coming up ahead. And though we were already going slow, there was no stopping the car entirely. As soon as our tires touched the wet dirt on the edge of the road, it was as if we were ripped off the side of the mountain. Time seemed to slow down as we tumbled through the darkness, the world spinning around us. The sickening thud of metal against rocks echoed through the night, mingling with our screams of terror. Finally, the car stopped moving, and I looked over to Devin to see if he was all right. He seemed conscious, but neither of us could really move much. We looked outside of the shattered windows, and the world that surrounded us seemed devoid of all life. And as I got a closer look at our immediate surroundings, I realized that we were trapped. Our car had gotten lodged on the edge of a mountain, and there was no place for us to go. As time started to pass, the pain from the accident started to radiate through my body, and Devin said he was experiencing similar pains. I personally could feel the weight of bruises forming, the sharp ache of broken bones. Devin was dazed but conscious as he struggled to free himself from the twisted metal that surrounded us. We knew that help wasn't likely to come anytime soon, considering how remote of an area we were in, and very quickly, the reality of our situation started to hit us. Our phones were useless, with mine not getting any service and Devin's being somewhere out of reach. It likely was thrown from the car in the tumble. And with each hour that passed, our isolation from the world became more and more obvious. The night turned to day as time passed, and then day turned back into night. As hunger set in, we scavenged what little supplies we could salvage from the wreckage, rationing what little that we found meticulously. But it was the darkness that really took its toll on us. A second day came and went, and with that night came an eerie silence that was only ever broken by the sharp howl of the wind. As we grew more and more tired, our minds began playing tricks on us. The shadows began to dance, and the trees seemed to twist and morph into different shapes as we became more and more delirious. We clung to the belief that help would eventually arrive, that our ordeal would come to an end. Finally, after 2 agonizing days of waiting, the sound of distant engines reached our ears. I could feel the tears of joy rolling down my face as I caught the first sight of the rescue team that was making their way up the treacherous mountain, and soon after, we saw the helicopter that accompanied them. Tears streamed down our faces as they pulled us to safety, offering warmth, sustenance, and the promise of a return to civilization. The road trip that had begun as a journey of adventure and discovery had transformed into a harrowing fight for survival. The mountain had tested our limits, pushing us to the edge of despair. But thankfully, we both made it out all right.